with you, Andrew.
Anita, thank you very much for that. As promised, we've been joined by two scientists you mentioned, the climate change skeptic, Professor Fred Singer, and Professor Bob Watson. He's the Chief Scientific Advisor at the Department of the Environment and therefore not a skeptic. Professor Singer, what is the single biggest reason that makes you think that this whole business of CO2 and global warming isn't true?
We see no evidence in the climate record that the increase in carbon dioxide, which is real, has made any appreciable difference in the climate. Climate change has been going on for millions of years and has always been natural. No reason to think that it would suddenly stop in the 20th century.
But the climate has been getting warmer overall from the 70s onwards? And we've seen CO2 rising as well.
You can only say that the climate has warmed since the Little Ice Age, which was about 300 years ago, when the Thames used to freeze over every winter. So there has been a general warming. If you look into it in detail, there has been some warming in the 20th century, then some cooling, then some warming again, and for the last decade or so, the climate has not been warming.
Okay,
in fact, it's been cooling.
Professor Watson, what do you say to that? That there's no clear link in temperature variations between the temperatures as measured and the CO2 emissions?
First, there's absolutely no doubt we've increased the concentration of carbon dioxide by about 30% since the industrial era. It's a greenhouse gas. Simple physics says if you increase the concentration of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere, the temperature of the Earth should respond and warm. There's also absolutely no doubt in the last 100 years, temperatures have increased. Ground-based data, radiosonde, that's balloon data, satellite data. And in the last 50 years, we've looked very carefully at the temperature record and we've looked very carefully at the theoretical models, and there's a very good correspondence to what you would predict should have happened to the Earth's climate and what we've absolutely observed.
So are you saying that overall in the 20th century the trend of temperatures was rising?
Yes.
But not by a huge amount, correct?
About 0.75 degrees Celsius over the last 150 years, with land areas warming more than the ocean and the high latitudes warming more than the tropical areas.
Professor, throughout the 20th century there was a trend of rising temperature.
Yeah, we don't dispute that carbon dioxide has increased. And I do believe that it is a greenhouse gas, and it's plausible that there should be a detectable effect. But as we analyze the data, we don't see the effect of increasing carbon dioxide. For example, the models cannot explain why there hasn't been a warming in the last 10 years. Why is it cooling while carbon dioxide is rising? So clearly there's no direct correspondence. What's the answer to that, Professor?
A lot of the climate skeptics point to a peak of temperature in 1998. It shows CO2 emissions still rising, but temperatures have not been rising. If anything, they've been in either static or a modest decline.
Absolutely correct. What you look at the temperature record is that over a decadal period, there are periods of warmer and cooler. And that's due to a change of the energy between the atmosphere and the ocean. It's a natural variability. But superimposed upon that, especially in the last 50 years, is a significant increase in temperature caused by greenhouse gases. So it's not at all surprising that in the last 10 years there's been a flattening.
But the models didn't show that.
But the models would show it in the sense that if you look at a model and look at natural variability, there are periods where you get a flattening and an increase. And you have to remember the last 10 years have still been the warmest temperatures on record. Every year since the year 2000 has been in the top 10 warm years.
Does that take into account the heat island effect? Because
absolutely.
Many of the ground temperatures taken in America in the Midwest in the mid-30s show higher temperatures than now.
Very good point. And in fact, when you take these temperature records, you do have to allow for the urban heat island effect. You also allow we don't have a perfect distribution of the thermometers around the world, where the oceans are very underrepresented. So very good point. We have to take that into account.
Yeah. One must be very careful about surface data. The satellite data that I'm mostly familiar with don't show what the surface data show. The surface data tend to be contaminated by urban heat island effect, as Bob Watson has mentioned, but also by poor placement of stations and many other problems.
So what do the satellite data show then?
Satellite data show essentially, since 1979, they show essentially no warming, no perceptible warming, then a sudden jump, and then in the last 10 years, a slight decline.
And you don't think that's related
The
to
sudden
CO2?
jump doesn't
Well,
match
wasn't that an El Nino
any
effect?
climate model would say.
There's no question the satellite data has one advantage, is a true global data set. Doesn't measure the surface temperature, measures it in the lower atmosphere, which is still very important. And in reality, that surface data we've got is quite consistent with the satellite data. It does show a warming until about 10 years ago, and like the ground-based data, tends to show a flattening. Absolutely consistent with what you would expect.
Except, I repeat again, that none of the models told us there was going to be a 10-year flattening. None of the models in the mid-90s on which the IPCC report is based told us that there would be this flattening. But indeed, Mr. Gore and the IPCC and all the rest showed us this hockey stick, which just showed just a huge rise.
But if you look at what the models show and they simulate the last 100 years, you actually see them sort of doing this sort of effect. So what we call the interdecadal variability is well understood, basically. So one of the key issues is understanding natural variability, but how human activities have superimposed a significant increase due to human activities.
The models actually don't do that unless you train them to do this. These variations that my colleague here describes were put in after the fact to explain why there was, for example, a cooling between 1940 and 1975.
That's when we were all worried about the Ice Age.
35 years of cooling. There were people worried about a coming Ice Age. I was not among those, but many of my friends were.
You weren't worried about the Ice Age or the warming part. You're a kind of temperate man, I think.
I'm a temperate, yes. Yes.
Professor, let me ask you this, because you're associated with the University of East Anglia's Climate Centre, the CRU. What do you make of these emails that have suddenly come out that have appeared, which the UEA tried to stop being published, in which one of your colleagues talks about using a trick to hide the decline, and then asks another of his colleagues to delete emails to Michael Mann, who is the great global warming supporter in the United States?
First, I think we should have a public inquiry.
You do?
Both, effectively, it was an illegal act to hack, and that would say why was it hacked, how was it hacked, and we should also have the inquiry to look at the data. I think there's no evidence any data has been destroyed. At the moment, all the data has not been issued to the world.
You don't think these emails were deleted?
I would like to see the public inquiry look into that very carefully.
Why? Can I just ask, because I'm slightly puzzled, since it's clear that national security is not at stake here, and that I suppose we, the British taxpayer, fund the University of East Anglia's climate work. Why wouldn't all this information, all of its data, be made public just as a matter of course?
Very simple. The data is actually owned by the national meteorological services all around the world. And in fact, the university has asked all of these national services, can we allow their data to be given out to the world? So we've already asked for it under the Freedom of Information Act, and hopefully
But the UEA was trying to avoid the Freedom of Information Act. Some of these exchanges said, don't tell them there's an FOI around. And your side of the argument is asking us, the taxpayer across the globe, to make massive changes in our lifestyle, and yet massive changes in the way things are done. Now, you may be right, but surely you have an obligation to make all the data available.
Agreed, and we need to make the data.
But you haven't.
Because we haven't been allowed to, because we don't own the data. It's owned by the national. But the point is, independently.
That sounds like
even if you put
tap dancing.
But even if you put all of that data aside, we have two major data sets in the United States by NASA and NOAA. They analyse the same type of data sets, obviously, as University of East Anglia, and they get basically the same results. So you could throw all of the university data away, and you'd still come with the same conclusion.
John Cassidy, this debate is also taking place in the United States, isn't it? I mean, the global warming consensus is showing signs of cracking a bit at the edges.
I would say there's less questioning in the US. I mean, it seems to me, you've got model-based data and regular data. What we saw in the financial crisis is you could never rely on the models. I'd be more interested in the raw data than the...
But we're not allowed to get to that yet.
Well,
which as a journalist, I think you would like to see.
Sure, obviously I would, yeah.
I think I should mention that we've set up an independent inquiry into how the data are used and what conclusions can be drawn. And this is a group called the NIPCC, which is completely independent of the IPCC and is not supported by governments.
All right.
It is a non-governmental group of scientists, and our report says nature, not human activity, rules the climate.
All right, we just